I can't wait to introduce my next guest to you. His name's David Harsanyi. He's a writer at the Federalist, and he's joining us for his very first time on the show this morning. Good morning, David. Thank you very much for joining us on the program today. Grateful for your time.
No, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. We've been having this discussion this morning about Kanye West, statements that he's made about, Jewish conspiracies to keep him down. We sort of beat that to death. But what we haven't talked about here is the sort of the left's double standard when it comes to Kanye's remarks. Your latest column there, or the column that I read here, I guess is from October, where you talk about the left's double standard here when it comes to anti-Semitism. Would you like to state your case?
Sure. Well, I think I actually wrote something yesterday as well, kind of clarifying my argument about this. And it's not just a double standard. It's that the left likes to take one side of the anti-Semitism problem, which I don't think is ideologically driven. I think far left and far right are typically embracing it, and then they make the case that it's simply being, propelled by one side of the ideological divide. I think they overstate the case of anti-Semitism. I'm not saying Kanye is not an anti-Semite or Fuentes is not anti-Semitic. I'm just saying that they overstate the problem as far as a political problem, right? There's always been anti-Semitism out there. So, they ignore Ilhan Omar, or they ignore the decades-long relationship between many people in Congress and Farrakhan, or they ignore, Al Sharpton, who, when I was growing up was anti-Semite number one where I lived, who has a show, who has a show on and gets paychecks from NBC. So I don't want to overstate the problem, but I think that for them it's just a political cudgel. It's not anything that they're really trying to deal with or wrestle with in any substantive way.
Now, in terms of like how the left views that, philosophically, I mean, the double standard is sort of baked in, if you will. So my understanding of it, David, is that the left is aware of their double standards, right? It's not as if they're doing this and they're unaware of what's going on. They know for a fact what they're doing. It's just that they maintain this double standard because they see the left, they see their opponents as uniquely evil, and that anyone who is on their side needs to be protected. Is that pretty much your estimate of it as well?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they believe, or they've convinced themselves, that democracy, which just means stuff they want, is under, there's an existential threat to it. So they'll make the case that one party rule will save democracy. It doesn't even make sense, right? But this is their case, and it's any means necessary to protect that power. I'll give you a great example. 2 days ago, or yesterday maybe, the New York Times ran a big column about how anti-Semitism was being normalized by Michelle Goldberg, who lives in New York. And she did not mention the 800 attacks in her city, a very left-leaning city, by minorities predominantly, on Hasidic Jews and religious Jews in Brooklyn and elsewhere. I mean, to ignore that and not even mention it in a column about anti-Semitism just shows you that it's just this partisan talking point that they like to pull out to bash the opposition over their heads. And it's not to excuse, Donald Trump or his meeting with Kanye or anything like that. It's just it's just a fact.
Do you believe Donald Trump when he said he had no idea who Fuentes was?
Well, there are three possibilities. One, he didn't know, and that like this Nazi guy can get a meeting with the former president and presidential campaign. That's not good. He did know that. That's not good. And meeting with Kanye himself just shows how unserious Donald Trump is most of the time. And, again, I'm not one of these reflexive, like, never Trumpers or anything like that. I think he did some good things, but I'm just not sure why anyone wants or needs to go through that circus again with his just simply bad decision making. When, if you're a conservative, do you think Ron DeSantis would ever have met with Fuentes? It seems unlikely to me.
If you're just tuning in to the Wake Up America show with Austin Petersen, I'm speaking to David Harsanyi. He's a writer at the Federalist, and we're talking about Donald Trump's meeting with Kanye West and Nick Fuentes from last week, as well as the left's double standard on anti-Semitism. Now, David, I saw that you had written a book recently that was titled Euro Trash. And the subheading of it is Why America Must Reject the Failed Ideas of a Dying Continent. And I'll say that while I haven't had a chance to read your book yet, one of my main gripes that I've had recently with this national movement within the Republican Party, they call themselves National Conservatives, is that it reminds me very much of more of a European Toryism than it does of an American conservatism, where American conservatism to me is much more associated with libertarianism, with the Wild West, with cowboys and with gold and with God and guns. Whereas this new national conservative movement strikes me as much more about God and country, and about king and country, rather than the sort of American conservatism that was more associated with, like, the Tea Party, for example. You've written recently as well about the national conservative movement, that they perhaps have a higher opinion of themselves and what they might be able to actually accomplish in terms of electoral success.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that movement is a dead end. Though I will say that it's factional, so there are different kinds of people within that movement that have different ideas, and frankly, sometimes it's hard for me to understand. I'm not sure they have a coherent, cohesive, agenda yet. But in general, seems to me that they think they've tripped over this new idea, but they're just a new kind of Buchananism. We tried this in the early 90s in a much more socially conservative time, with many more people in unions and all of that. And even then it was unsuccessful. I'm not sure why they think it's going to be successful politically. Ideologically, I have huge problems with it, because I don't think the idea that you're going to compete with progressives and Democrats in government programs and welfare programs and technocratic job creation and stuff like that, you're never going to beat them at that game. You shouldn't even try, because it's a bad idea. But even if, even in trying to get votes, it's not going to work. The sort of protectionist mindset, I think what they're doing is chasing working class voters. There's nothing wrong with working class voters or trying to get working class voters, and there's nothing wrong with being working class. But it's a shrinking demographic, while you have these suburbs which are growing in places like Arizona and Nevada, and you're leaving those people behind because your message does not appeal to them. So, I mean, I'm a fusionist, basically, and I think that is the most idealistic, most American way, political ideology, and the most successful political ideology that perhaps ever existed in America, or at least in modern times, post-Civil War. And to throw that away and mock it for something, to go back to the late 1800s and be a mercantilist type, it just doesn't make sense to me. And Republicans have lost 3 elections now with these types of candidates chasing these types of issues. So it's been a pretty big failure. So that's basically my case on national conservatism.
It almost seems as if the National Conservatives see a greater enemy in libertarians than they do in Social Democrats. Quite frequently, I will see writings by these National Conservatives where they embrace Marxists and they put Marxists at the head of their magazines, while they denounce the libertarian right and claiming that we are responsible for progressive victories here in the United States. How would you respond to that, David?
Yeah, I mean, you're right about that, and I think there's oftentimes these people are just statists who believe in God, and when it comes to economics, when it comes to other ideas, basically, believe in the things that progressives believe in. I would say that they often blame capitalism for the reason, for churches shrinking, for people being immoral, for things like that. I don't think there's any evidence for that. I don't think poor people are more moral, or people who live under authoritarian regimes are more moral. I also actually think that the welfare state was one of the leading reasons why families have been broken up in this country. I think the state crowds out community and charity, and by crowding out the local church or the local charity, they destroy those communities. I'm not saying that progress and the internet and the things that we haven't done some of that as well, but the state has never in history. I always ask these people to give me an example of where this works, and they'll talk about Hungary, right, where the average per household makes $10,000 less than the average household in Mississippi, our poorest state. Just because you're a tourist in Europe and you see a nice city doesn't mean that the people elsewhere are living these wonderfully moral and wealthy lives. They are not. So I guess that's what I would say to them. I have more to say, but that would be the crux of it.
But David, it is inherently American that there is something that that has caught hold to the public. It used to be exclusively a domain of the left, but now it's very much a domain of the right as well. To hate rich people and to see them, being wealthy and being a billionaire is something inherently immoral. What do you think has caused this change? Because it used to be when we would have these fights over capitalism, we were fighting the left, but now we're fighting Marco Rubio when it comes to capitalism. They see it as destructive to the family. They see free markets as inherently immoral. How do we respond to these kinds of attacks on capitalism from the right?
Well, it's difficult. It's difficult because populism is basically an emotional argument, and no one, and people, when people think of the economy as a zero-sum proposition, which most people probably do, they see someone who has a lot and they wonder why they don't have more, and they look at those people with some amount of envy. That hasn't really been an American trait. We have not been a class conscious society. So I don't like that that's being injected into our discussions on the right, because I think in America, most people believe in meritocracy, or did, and they believe they can move from class to class. Immigrants here become richer. We have far more movement and far than Europeans, for instance. And the more the state intrudes, the less dynamic the economy is, things like that, the less movement you'll see. I always like with Marco Rubio, who frankly just chases whatever's, whatever. I remember him as a Tea Party type. He just chases whatever's trendy on the right. He's not going to be he will talk about manufacturing jobs and romanticize like lunch pail, 70s and stuff like that. But he's not going to send his kids to a factory to work there, right? It's always for the proles and the others who they want to live that way. I think Americans want their kids to do better than they did. I sure do. And so I find the emotional appeal of that argument lacking. But, we have to admit that it does have some resonance with people who struggle over, in Rust Belt cities where creative, I hate to like throw around these libertarian terms, but we're like, creative destruction
No,
has
don't worry.
destroyed.
It's a safe place for these big terms. Go ahead.
A safe space, yeah.
Yeah.
So, that is how the economy works, and you can't, you'll never be able to change the rules of progress in the economy. So,
right. But they despise that, right? So this is why
yeah.
so many on the right see libertarians as the enemy, because they claim that it is the job of government to protect American jobs and to ensure that iPhones aren't being manufactured in sweatshops in China, because they claim that those jobs, those manufacturing jobs, need to be returned to the American people where they claim that they rightfully belong. And I mean, how can you certainly can't run for office, David, on a platform of saying I'm a globalist and I believe in allowing sweatshops in China to manufacture your iPhones at the expense of the American worker. I mean, it's a hell of a sell, David.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think sweatshops aren't a bad right in certain
Yes,
countries.
same here, and that's why they hate us.
But I have to say, China presents a unique situation in that they do have slave labor, right? So
Yes.
I think that China is, just to say that trade with China should be, and I'm basically don't even believe in any kind of like trade barriers with countries, but I think when you have a slave state, it does present a unique actual slave state, not sweatshops, or low salaried workers, but actual slaves. That obviously presents a moral problem. But yeah, in general, I agree with you. No one's going to, but this has always been the case, so let's save manufacturing jobs, but let's save, I don't, or, they romanticize the manufacturing. They think if we're not making things here, we're losing, when in fact, this is how we grow the economy. This is how we grow wealth. This is how people live better lives. But it is interesting, and it's a big topic, and I don't have any answers. This thing where life keeps getting better for most people, but most people are unhappier, right? And so there's a lot of that going on, and our politics reflect that. I am very pessimistic about the future because I think the right is moving towards a more statist, authoritarian mindset, especially younger people. I see it in. I was at CPAC a few years ago, and some guy from First Things magazine, which is this socially conservative Catholic magazine, basically, I think it's Catholic. And he said, one of the big problems in society is we have too many choices and too much freedom. And the whole place started clapping. This is the same place I like 5 years ago, it would have been the opposite with Tea Party type. So it is concerning.
Yeah, I did. I drove them bonkers on Twitter one day when I said that national conservatism is just Bernie Sanders, but it goes to church on Sunday. And some people, and a lot of them were like, you know what? You're right. Absolutely. And I mean, that's why you saw Tucker Carlson embracing Elizabeth Warren's economic plan. That's why you see, people like Ron DeSantis going and speaking at those conferences. And I think it's because, they see this as in vogue. I mean, sort of like what Marco Rubio did. But I mean, like you said in your column, if freedom works and if Tea Party conservatism was on the rise, Ron DeSantis would probably be going and speaking at those conferences. So I guess my final question there for you, David, is thoughts on Ron DeSantis?
I know he showed up at those at the NatCon conference, but I feel like that's just him. And don't get me wrong, I think there are many, there are some aspects of both his personality and the way he deals with corporations and things like that have great appeal to that faction among conservatives. But also, people move to Florida because they have really low taxes and a really low regulatory environment, and the things that they like. They're not going there because he's yelling at Disney. And by the way, I think that as people with who are more libertarian, I consider myself like a classical liberal because I do have problems with modern libertarians in some ways, which we can get into another time. But
Yes,
but
we
the
will.
thing is, yeah, okay. But the thing is, he basically embraces kind of a Reagan-esque, policy of fusionism. Basically, I mean, he's oh yeah, that's what I want to say. So like when he goes after corporations for crony capitalism, where this is another debate I have with these NatCon types, is like you want more government, but really these corporations have power because of the state, not because there isn't enough state. You know what I'm saying? They have like the vaccine thing, without the state imposing itself on citizens, that whole debate wouldn't have happened. You would have done whatever you wanted to most of the time. So anyway, so I think Ron DeSantis has a lot of features or policy positions that can bring together probably more conservatives than any other candidate I can think of right now. Maybe Youngkin's that kind of candidate too.
David, conversations like these, and for many of our listeners, is like great sex. We appreciate it very much. We want to definitely have you back on the program.